Hello and welcome to Race Streamer. A bit of a different video this one because I'm going to be commentating over some onboard footage that I captured last week when I took part in the Stage 2 part of the Want2Race driver competition. So for anyone that doesn't know what the competition is, Want2Race is a Ginetta team and they run a competition every year for any budding drivers, regardless of whether you've got a race licence or not, who want the opportunity to potentially win a fully funded season racing in the GRDC, which is the Ginetta Racing Drivers Club or Championship, whatever it's called. And the second stage of the competition, which is what I took part in a week ago, as you can see from the footage, takes place at Blyton Park on the outer circuit, and it involves driving the GRDC spec, Ginetta G40. So what happens on the day when you go up is you get a couple of sessions in the car alongside some instructors who basically give you tips on how to, I guess, drive safer on the track, and then ultimately, if they're happy with you, then how you can drive a bit faster. And they score you on the day to see how your driving is, and based off that you then find out whether you've progressed to the final stage of the competition, which is in October. And I don't know if I was good enough on the day yet, but here's the footage from what happened anyways. So one of the really cool things about the competition, regardless of the prize, is who the instructors are that you've got sitting next to you. So in the footage that you're watching at the moment, I've got David Pittard sitting next to me. For anyone who doesn't know who he is, just search for him on Google. His racing history speaks for itself, really. He's a very good driver, and I found him brilliant as an instructor. He gave me a lot of tips to do with braking into the corners, so trail braking to an extent. So I felt like I learnt a bit with him, but to be fair, that bit that I learnt was super useful. So this was my second run of the day. I did get footage of the first session where I had Lewis Brown sitting next to me as instructor, who's racing in the mini challenge at the moment, but that didn't record any audio from it, so I decided to leave that out of this video. But this session being the second one of the day, I'd already been round and found out what the grip levels were like in the dry round Blyton. I haven't driven the circuit before this day, so I had to learn the circuit as well as kind of learning the car, and in the second session I was happy to push on a little bit quicker. Now, about, I don't know, 30 seconds ago, you would have seen a car come flying past me. That's one of the Ginetta Junior drivers who was absolutely ragging it around the circuit all day. Obviously was happy with how to drive the car on the limit, so fair play to them because they were putting in some really good laps all day. But for the rest of us that were there for the competition, it was very much a learning day. Learning the cars, learning the circuit, and trying to just start to push the limits without overstepping them too much. So part of the briefing, which was given to us by Ben Highland, who runs the Want2Race team, was they've got a very strict no spin policy. So essentially, if you spin out while you're on one of these test drives, then you get sent home, because I guess they want to look after their race cars, and you can't really blame them for wanting that, to be fair. So at the moment, I was driving rounds at what felt like a pretty fast pace, but was still pretty comfortable, and that's where most of the people on the day were at with this. Frankly, because they didn't want to spin out and be sent home, but also because there was a fairly large insurance excess that you definitely didn't want to have to dive into. So at the moment, my lap time is 1 minute 24. It's well down on the ultimate pace of the car. Just for reference, there's a good video online of David Pittard doing a lap in a Ginetta G40 in the dry, and the lap time from that was about a 1 minute 15.5. So there's a long way for me to go at this point in the session to get anywhere close to that kind of lap time. Some of the things that I was having to get used to in the car, which are massively different to a road car, and actually a bit different to some more, you could argue, advanced race cars, is the fact that there is no servo on the brakes. So for anyone that doesn't know, that effectively means that when you hit the brake pedal, you really have to mash it in terms of the amount of force you apply to it. So I guess we could be talking 50-60 kilos of pressure that you need to apply to it to get the car to stop. It's kind of hard to tell, but it's a big difference between when you're driving your casual road car and you can just put full pressure on the brake without really exerting any physical stress on yourself. So you properly have to lean on the brakes in this car. And further to that, there's no power steering in the car. There's a relatively heavy clutch and throttle pedal as well, just not as heavy as the brake. There's no anti-lock brakes, so this is a very raw car that I'm driving here. And the strange thing is, when you consider how this is like a feeder series to the British GT Championship, in the way that the GRDC Championship is literally on the same bill as the British GT Championship in terms of the weekends that it competes on, then it's bizarre how the G40 is arguably harder to drive than a lot of GT3 machinery, because I've been told that most of the GT3 machinery and GT4, they have traction control and anti-lock brakes, so it makes driving them pretty approachable compared to this car. At least that's my opinion on it anyway. So you can see me starting to push the limits of the car a little bit more now, getting on the throttle earlier, starting to brake later into corners as well, which was cool. It's really exciting driving these cars, and Blyton Park's are really tight and feels like a relatively technical circuit as well, so it's got a good few challenges there, even though it's not that undulating particularly. So some of the instruction I was getting at this point was to do with how early I could get on the throttle, and then maybe applying a little bit more pressure to the brake pedal here, especially in this corner where David was giving me a bit of a hand-on trying to release the brake. I think he said a little earlier, so I kind of carried a bit more speed into the first left, and a few times when I went through this corner here, he was telling me to unwind a bit of steering lock, so not turn into the corner quite as much, so that way I ran more onto the yellow paint on the outside. And another good thing is, when you're doing this experience, if there is someone who's a bit slower than you, or you are yourself slower, then you tend to get out of the way of each other. There's no racing on this circuit, at least in this scenario anyway, because it's just a test at the end of the day. So starting to get a bit more comfortable with the car at the moment. Lap times come down by about 5 seconds since I last said. Managed to get this corner a bit tidier than last lap this time, so generally getting a bit more comfortable. Following David's instruction, being pretty happy about it, and then I think somewhere around here, possibly next lap, I get a bit of oversteer going into that corner, so that's where I started pushing the trail braking quite a bit more. Now, in terms of lap time that you can achieve in this car, it's not magnificently fast. So as a rough comparison, when I saw the GRDC race at Brands Hatch Grand Prix about 2 weeks ago now, they were lapping the Grand Prix circuit. The pole lap was a 1 minute 50 dead, more or less. And I've been around there in my Toyota GT86, which is relatively stock, barring the fact that I've upgraded the brakes so that way it just doesn't die when it's on track. And I've been around there 3 seconds slower than these cars, so you could argue that 3 seconds a lot, but when you consider that you're talking about a road car versus this, which is meant to be a race car but it just happens to be road legal, then it's surprising how this car isn't actually that fast in the grand scheme of things. But if you take this car and you put it into a GT5 specification, where it's got a sequential gearbox, slick tyres, I think it might have a different differential as well, then suddenly it becomes a whole lot quicker. Hey, okay, and there's the oversteer moment. So I knew I was in the right place in terms of pushing it by the end of the session when I managed to get that done. And if you can hear from the engine revs, I'm not changing up at the red line of the car, so one of the requests from Ben and the instructors was that we change up a gear at 6,000 revs when the red line's at 6,800, so there's probably some more lap time to be found in there, but I guess again they just want to be a bit more mechanically sympathetic to the cars. Now, if you saw David's hand just there, that was where he was telling me to run a bit wider on the exit, and that allowed me to carry a bit more speed through the corner. And the good thing is, watching this back now, I can see a few more places where I can improve. Also bearing in mind the feedback that David gave me at the end of the session, which was generally that I could be a bit harder and a bit later on the brakes. But in terms of corner speed, it was pretty good, other than a few places towards the end of the lap where I can carry a bit more speed. And that's the session over and done with pretty quickly. So even in the space of time that I've been talking about it, it's just gone by again. And I remember on the day, it felt like a really quick run through of things. So yeah, that's the second stage of the Ginetta Want2Race competition, and that's it. Now, this being my first video that I've done commentary over, not really sure how it's gone, to be fair. So if you liked it, then let me know. If you think it sucked, let me know. It's good to get some feedback sometimes, and that way I can improve on videos in the future. If you want to see more, subscribe. See you next time.